Hello everyone, welcome to 2-Bit Studios, and this is going to be the first episode of the tutorial series for the MegaGrid plugin. In this episode, we'll go over the basics of setting up the MegaGrid plugin and creating your very first interactive grid. With that said, let's get right into it. So the first thing we need to do is configure a few project settings. So let's come to the Edit, Project Settings, and search for Trace Channel. And in the Trace Channel section, let's create two new trace channels. So the first one is going to be called AutoMap, and the default response will be set to ignore. Next, we'll create another channel and name it Grid Surface, and the default response once again will be set to ignore. Now the AutoMap channel is going to be used for automatically mapping the tile types of our grid. The grid surface is going to determine which actors in our scene are going to act as the grid surface. Once that's done, let's come back to our search bar and search for custom depth. And in the custom depth stencil pass, change it from disabled to enabled with stencil. This is for the rendering of our zero aliasing grid materials, which is going to be using a specific stencil value to mask out the grid surface only. In practice, what this means is that only the grid surface is going to receive the material. Everything else, every other actor in the scene is not going to receive that material. Step 2 for creating an interactive grid is choosing a grid surface. Now, MegaGrid plugin supports a huge variety of surfaces. You can create interactive grids on landscapes, custom height maps, custom meshes, and more. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to use the default landscape that comes with Unreal Engine 5.2. So let's select our landscape first, or our grid surface. In this case, the landscape uses landscape proxies, so we'll have to select all of them. Let's come all the way down and select all of our landscape proxies, so pretty much our partitions. Let's first enable the custom depth render pass. So let's search for custom depth and render custom depth pass. Enable that and set the custom depth stencil value to be 77. Now in the later versions of Unreal Engine, you might have a couple extra Boolean checks, but the core of it is actually the same. You just have to enable the render pass and then set the stencil value. Once the stencil value has been configured, let's come and set the collision channels. So search for collision, and then in the presets, let's change it from block all to custom. And here, let's come back to our trace responses, and we can see the newly created trace channels, AutoMap, and grid surface. By default, if you do not create a new level, the block all will be set to block all, but you do remember that we have configured it to be ignore. And that is because Unreal Engine has this weird thing where you have to create a new level for the project settings changes to take place. For now, we're going to manually set it to ignore. So AutoMap set to ignore, and the grid surface is going to be set to block. Once the collision has been configured, we need to add an actor tag. So let's come and search for tag, and under the actor advanced tags, let's add a grid surface. Make sure you follow the exact spelling here with a capital G and a capital S. And also make sure that you're adding an actor tag and not a component tag. If you're using landscapes, by default it should be an actor tag, but in a static mesh component, or if you're using custom meshes, you might get a component section as well, but you need to add it to the actor section. Well, that's pretty much it for our surface preparation. In the next step, we'll go over placing actors in our scene. Step number 3 for creating our interactive grid is placing a save handler into the scene. Before we do that, let's actually save the level. So Control S, new folder, maps, and here we'll call it a tutorial map number 1, and then save it. Once that has been saved, let's come to the content browser, plugins, MegaGrid content, blueprints, core, and then we'll have an actor called save handler. Click it and drag it into the scene. You can place it wherever you want. The location does not matter, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to make it at the world center. The next thing we need to specify is a save name. Now, MegaGrid plugin supports multi-level saves, and it does this through the .save file system. So Unreal provides a powerful save system using the .save files, and MegaGrid plugin does utilize the system. So we need to specify a save file to load and save this level's grid data to. In order to do that, let's come into the details panel of our save handler, save name, search for save name, and then under the save name, let's give any name we want. So I'm going to call this tutorial save 1. This will be created as a save file. So tutorial save 1 underscore 1, or sorry, tutorial save underscore 1 dot save will be created to your saved folder in your project directory. So in order to actually create the save file, we need to create save grid or click save grid. And then in the output log, you will see grid subsystem, save grid data, save name. Since the save name does not exist, it creates a new save name with the specified name. Now, once you have created the save file, you have to immediately load it. So we'll create load grid, and if we go back to the log, we'll see loading grid data from file tutorial save 1 and grid save handler log as well. We'll have a loaded grid save data from tutorial save 1. So this means that you have successfully created a save file and you have also loaded it for this level to use. Now, one thing to note here is when I say multi-level grid systems, it doesn't mean that the level itself is going to create unique keys or seeds to create grid data. We are pretty much talking about loading save files for that specific level. So you can actually load this exact same file in a different level, which will create the grid save to this exact save file. So you can have two levels with the same grid data. So once the save files has been created and loaded, another thing I want to show you is the references for the code dependencies. We have Grid Manager and a Grid Visuals reference. These two will be used for, again, creating the grid and loading the grid, but currently we don't have them in the scene. So let's keep this in mind and we'll come back to it when we do have the actors in the scene. Step number 4 is to place the Grid Visuals actor into the scene. So let's come back to our content browser. Again, in the MegaGrid content blueprint score, we'll see the BP Grid Visuals. Let's click it and drag it into the scene. And now you'll suddenly see a grid appear into your level. And this is again using the default grid data that we just created. So when we create a new save file, a default grid data is created along with it with a tile count of 100 into 100. And that's why you see 100 into 100 tiles here. The fifth step in creating an interactive grid is placing the grid manager into the scene. So let's come back to our content browser again, and we'll see the grid manager actor. Click it and drag it into the scene. Again, location does not matter, but for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to center it to the world position. Now, what is the grid manager? Well, as a developer, most of the time you're going to be referencing the grid manager for the functionality or interactions with the grid. Grid manager is meant to be the middleman between the visuals and the data. In the grid manager details panel, let's come all the way down to code dependencies and you'll see grid visuals. Now, as soon as I click the reference, the grid will shrink to match the settings that we have specified in the grid manager. So the grid visuals will sort of change itself to fit the description of the default grid manager settings. So the grid size is 200 200 and the tile count is 20 by 20. Now if I change the line width here, we can sort of see why I would call this the middleman of the visuals and the data. and we can customize the grid to whatever that we want it to be. Now remember, we have to assign the save handler references as well. So let's come back to BP save handler, and let's come back to the core dependency section, grid manager, and grid visuals. With them both assigned, let's come and save the grid, and then Control S as well. Make sure you regularly save your grid via the BP save handler, because this is the only way to sort of save your grid data and changes. You have to manually come here and click these two buttons. The last step in creating our first interactive grid is to actually spawn the tiles of the grid. Currently we have the visual representation of the grid, but again, it's only the visuals of the grid. There's no data related to the grid, and thus we cannot interact with the grid. But all the hard part is out of the way. In order to create the tiles, we can simply come to BP Grid Manager, and in the default section you'll see a whole lot of editor buttons. But the only thing we are concerned with right now is the Create Grid. But before I hit that, I want to show you what happens in the Begin Play or the Plane editor. So if I hit the play button, you see nothing really happens. So we don't have any interaction with the grid. Once I hit the Create Grid button, nothing really happens visually, but once I hit the play button, you can see we have a tile under cursor function working. This function is called by the BP Grid Manager. So if you don't want this function, you can go ahead and unplug it. Well, that's pretty much it. You have your first very own interactive grid using the MegaGrid plugin. Now, obviously, we don't have much going on right now. We can play around with the random obstacles. So come back to Grid Manager and check the random obstacles boolean and create grid. You'll sort of see a lot of random obstacles. Make sure that you do save it before you exit the project. So come back to your save handler and hit save once again. Now you can safely exit the project. You can close the project and come back again and work. Well, that's pretty much it for this tutorial. It's all about getting started with the plugin and creating your very first interactive grid. I have a challenge for you. Try to change the grid shape to a hexagon. So in the next episode, we'll be working with a hexagonal grid, and we'll be covering different types of populating methods. So currently we have a random obstacle grid or an empty grid. In the next episode, we'll be covering how to specifically map tiles. With that said, I'll see you in the next one.